Welcome back, everyone, to Vox Markets. My name is Paul Hill, and I'm delighted today to be able to speak to Paul Pagano, CEO of LungLife AI, a next-generation lung cancer diagnostics firm. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Excellent to be here.
Yeah, well, big congrats on yesterday's successful IPO, raising £17 million at 176p, with the shares closing around about 15% up on the day. So that was pretty good. But before we sort of dig into the details, I don't suppose you could quickly run us through what sort of key problem the technology solved, just briefly how it works and why it's chosen to use circulating tumor cells as its sort of key biomarker for early stage lung cancer diagnosis.
Yeah, so we're focused on lung cancer. As you might be aware, it's the #1 cancer killer. Kills more than the next three most common cancers combined. That's your breast, prostate, and colorectal cancer. And the reason is that most of those cancers are diagnosed in late stage. In fact, 80% of all lung cancers are diagnosed late. So there's a critical unmet need to find early detection solutions. So that's why we decided to focus on lung cancer. And circulating tumor cells in particular represented the ideal biomarker for that disease. As it turns out, lung cancer spreads early through these circulating tumor cells. These are small bits of the tumor that enter the bloodstream and try and spread to different parts of the body. And so by capitalizing on the body's normal process, we end up with a really high-performing, well-balanced technology.
So what you're saying is then a circulating tumor cell is basically part of that actual cancer. So you're actually testing that cancer rather than testing anything sort of like intermediate or another sort of like indicator that it is cancer. So you've basically got the blueprint of that tumor
right in front of us, and we can see it under the microscope. And there's importance, Paul, and you touched on this, in having a direct measurement of that cancer. There are other approaches. For example, you can look at the body's response or the immune response to cancer. There might be additional information to be had there, but when you look at a direct measure, it gives you a high degree of confidence of what you're looking at and how to call that test result.
Yeah, and why has it been so difficult to actually sort of like look at circulating tumor cells or CTCs for so long? Is it because, I mean, it's like a needle in a haystack. There's very few of them, particularly in early stage. Is that right?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah.
I almost think of it more of as a needle in a stack of needles. It's just, which one are you looking for? Is this the right thing?
Yeah.
Incredibly rare, right? You could have one circulating tumor cell in 1 billion cells or 2 billion cells. And so, part of it's the technology to get that one cell and have it in sufficient purity to look at. But then the flip side of that is how you detect that cell. And it's in the detection bit that really is LungLife strength technology. There are other techs that might get it confused with a white blood cell, which is normal. Everybody has them. And so making sure you're absolutely specific, yes, this is a bona fide cancer cell, is of critical utmost importance. And so you have to do both well, find the cells and then be able to detect it properly.
Okay, so let's just do a sort of like a case study. Let's do me, for instance. I mean, I'm a non-smoker, but let's just assume I was a smoker. I've been so up to about 35, 40. I'm currently 50. I'm just starting to suffer now from a bit of coughing, etc., and sort of like not feeling great. I go down to the doctor's, and he has a look at me and says, "Crikey, you look a bit ill. Can you go and have a sort of like a scan?" What does that sort of involve? And then when would this sort of like the LungLife test, this blood biopsy then be taken, blood draw test be taken?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I mentioned before, most lung cancers are diagnosed late, right? And this is when you have back pain, for example. The lung will spread to the bone and cause a lot of pain. And that's when people get their CT scan and, oh my goodness, it's kind of too late at that point. But there are some that are found early, for example, from that early cough or through a proper lung cancer screening program. And it's through these programs where they'll take a CT scan of the chest. It's basically a 3-dimensional X-ray, and they'll see a spot on your lungs. But this is where the trouble gets in, especially for the clinician, because they're not sure if that spot is lung cancer or if it's scar tissue or a viral infection or a fungal infection, which we know from COVID, it could be incredibly common, right? And the tools at the physician's disposal are inadequate, right? You can either get a biopsy, That's where they stick a long needle across the chest wall, try and grab a little bit of that tumor.
And that's quite dangerous, presume. That's quite dangerous as a patient, isn't it? If you're sticking that
20% have an adverse event, and we're not talking minor things. We're talking collapsed lung, bleeding, really potentially bad things.
Yeah.
There's also the wait and see pathway. That's where you come back in 3 or 6 months, get another scan, see if that nodule's gotten any bigger. Great news for the patient, by the way. Now they have a lot of anxiety wondering if they have a tumor growing inside them. That's where LungLife's technology comes in. So it's going to give that doctor and that person with the indeterminate nodule more information to make an informed decision. Should I go off and get more aggressive workup, i.e. this is likely cancer, or is this likely not cancer, and therefore maybe I should go back into a screening program or some sort of non-invasive follow-up. And so that's where our sweet spot is for this technology initially.
And so if you're basically screening or you're doing this blood test essentially after the CT scan to help a doctor or a physician decide whether a nodule is benign or cancerous, okay, so I can understand that. So what's the sort of accuracy currently after sort of like your initial sort of like preliminary sort of pilot test of this sort of like lung cancer test?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So we had a pilot study with 149 patients, multiple centers. It was blinded, so we didn't know the results of the biopsy before we got the blood test results. And so what we saw was a 76% sensitivity, 71% specificity, and most importantly, an 89% positive predictive value. And that might be a new metric, but to put that into context, sensitivity and specificity, they're great to tell you how your test performs, but it's a measurement of the past. How well did your test perform in a particular study? It's that positive predictive value metric that's really important to doctors, because in the clinic, it's all about the future, i.e. I have an indeterminate nodule. I need to predict whether or not it's cancer. And so that 89% basically says if LungLife has a positive test result, 89% of the time that's cancer. You should do something about this. So that's the level of the performance that the doctors need in order to make that informed decision on what to do with that indeterminate nodule.
Right, and there's just nothing out there currently, is there, to sort of like to compare? I mean, that 89% is sort of like, I mean, it's best in class, is it?
Yeah, standard of care right now is to couple things like the PET scan, nodule size. The bigger it is, the more likely it's cancer. And right now that's performing at around a 60% positive predictive value.
Wow.
So the 89% really, we feel is going to provide additional information to that doctor on what to do next.
And the benefits then, I'm guessing, what you said, run through what the benefits to the patient. Presumably they get an early diagnosis of whether it's in or out, so they can stop worrying.
That's key and utmost, right?
Yeah.
I mean, lung cancer, it's, most are diagnosed late. Survival is incredibly low if it's late. So if you can provide that early diagnosis to that patient, you give them the best chances for effectively curing that lung cancer.
Before it spreads, basically, before it spreads.
Before it spreads, yeah. Standard of care there is surgery. So if you can go in and cut that tumor out early, then you give that person the best possible fighting chance. There's, in addition to the healthcare benefits, there's also cost benefits. The CT scan is relatively inexpensive. Here in the States, it's around $200 a test.
Yeah.
But the biopsy is $15,000. And if that biopsy results in an adverse event that requires hospitalization, the costs jump to around $38,000.
Right.
So in addition to reducing, any harms associated with the patients, if you can avoid unnecessary procedures or even repeat procedures, a lot of the times biopsy fails. Yeah. So you have to go off and do another one, and then the patient goes to surgery anyway. Yeah. You're talking about potentially massive savings to the healthcare institutions as well.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, I did notice part of the company's name had AI at the end of it. Could you explain how the artificial intelligence sort of feeds into it then?
Yeah, it's not just for glitz and glamour. So we have AI working in a couple areas. Yeah. The immediate early area is in the test itself. Yeah. So we use what's called FISH, and that's where we apply light signals to the DNA. And you can pick those up under a microscope. So it's a really pretty picture that you can look at. We'll have some on our website. But this lends itself really well to artificial intelligence, because right now with FISH, sometimes you get really crisp signals. Sometimes you get signals that are stretched out in 3D space, and a human can detect that really well. but the computer sometimes has trouble because it can only detect two-dimensional pictures, and you lose stuff in that 2D picture. So we've trained an AI algorithm to call those light signals more accurately. We've been working with Persistent Systems with them, great partner. You might recognize the name from Renalytics, but they're an absolute powerhouse in software development and AI. So we're really delighted with the early performance results we're seeing in that aspect.
And that so effectively, if you've got a predictive sort of like accuracy of 89%, the AI could well improve that accuracy and reduce and presumably reduce the time to actually get a positive or negative diagnosis, doesn't it? Is that right? Is that how it would work?
Absolutely right. So in the early studies, we're seeing a little bit of a boost in our sensitivity and positive predictive value, which we're delighted about. That means we're going to find more patients with cancer earlier. Fantastic. Kind of behind the scenes, we're seeing a reduction in the number of misclassified cells. And so that means the technician isn't spending a lot of time looking at the wrong thing.
Yeah, okay.
That's going to be really important. Again, we can turn around that test a lot more quickly to the physicians and their patients.
And how many sort of like, I don't know, biological signatures do you get when you sort of like, if you take a CTC and one's cancerous, presumably for every single person at every single point in their life, it's not the same. There must be literally thousands of different signatures and profiles that you have to be able to identify. So this isn't just a simple one size fits all. This must be sort of like a personalized medicine type of stuff.
It's getting there. You know, the base test is it's as simple as counting light signals.
Yeah.
And while we see different patterns from different patients, and you expect that even within the same patient, not every CTC looks exactly the same.
Yeah.
That's okay. We have a general enough program with just counting light signals that the patterns sort of blend into the background, and then we see very digitally cancer versus no cancer.
Right.
So
okay.
that's sort of the brilliance and the simplicity.
Okay. Then I did notice that one of your anchor investors is Mount Sinai, who I know from Verici and Renalytics and all these other guys, and they're a top medical science and health institute out in New York, and they usually only back winning horses. So could you take us through how you've managed to get those guys on board? I mean, that's a real sort of coup.
Yeah, we are really pleased to be working with Mount Sinai. I mean, you know, one of the people on our scientific advisory board, Dr. Claudia Henschke and Dr. David Yankelevitz, it's really where early lung cancer detection got started with low-dose CT scanning. They're at Mount Sinai, you know, and Mount Sinai has really doubled down on their efforts. So over the past couple of years, they've created what's called the Centers of Excellence program in thoracic oncology. And they've been recruiting world-renowned experts from all over the place. Fred Hirsch and Christian Rolfo, many other names, but essentially I'm going out of focus. There we go.
Yeah, that's better.
So they've been recruiting these world-renowned experts to double down on Dr. Claudia Henschke's work. They looked at LungLife's technology as a way to really create a world-class offer. Take this external technology, couple it with their internal expertise to really make an impact in patient care. Yeah, so we're delighted to be working alongside them.
Brilliant. And are they sort of how are they giving you access to some of their anonymized data, or how are they trying to accelerate the actual R&D process somehow?
Yeah, this is really where they flex their muscles. I mean, they have access to millions of de-identified patient records, hundreds of thousands of CT scan images. So through our relationship with Mount Sinai and our data license agreement, we'll have access to those data records. And the idea is we're going to create a family of products around LungLife's core technology to create a world-class offering for early stage lung cancer.
Brilliant. And are there any other uses for the you say early stage? Are you going to use it for sort of like, I don't know, if somebody's been surgery, sort of helping to a treatment or monitoring thereafter?
Yeah, we think that's a very natural step too for the technology. So, you know, with most cancers, if you detect it early, you can do surgery and effectively cure the patient. With lung cancer, it's a little bit different. So about 50% of the patients will have what's called recurrence. That's where they come back in 2 years and that lung cancer has returned.
Yeah.
Most commonly as metastatic disease. So it's spread through those circulating tumor cells. So we believe our CTT test is a very natural fit for post-surgical monitoring in the lung cancer space. So we're going to be kicking off a study in addition to indeterminate nodules in post-surgical monitoring as sort of a step 2 for the product.
And so putting that together, how big is this market? I mean, I have seen some of the sort of the industry giants claiming it's sort of like, you know, billions, but I know it's difficult because this is new technology, so it's a bit of a guess on how expensive the test is, how much you're going to sell it for, and how many sort of like, you know, people you're going to be testing each year. But just broad brush, how big do you think it could be?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the #1 cancer killer. 2 million people are diagnosed every year in the world, right?
Yeah.
250,000 in the United States alone.
Yeah.
And we've seen statistics that 1 in 16 people will develop lung cancer at some time in their lives. So it's there's a massive number of people out there that we feel can really benefit from this technology.
Yeah. Well, I did see a number of, I think it was Biodesics put something out like 5 billion, and I think Veracyte put 5 billion, but I would guess it might be something around
and we're in that ballpark as well.
It must be.
The tests are a little bit more expensive than ours.
Yeah,
so we're estimating around 3 billion for our market.
Okay, yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, who knows? But we're talking big beer anyway,
yes.
which is not a surprise. And then so what are you, having just raised sort of like 17 million pounds? What are you going to spend it on then? And how long is it sort of like? How further it's going to take you to sort of like your development and commercialization strategy?
Yeah, so we anticipate that those proceeds will take us to first nominal revenues, so it'll allow us to commercialize the test. We're going to be very focused on all things commercialization, so looking at regulatory approval, reimbursement support. So our pivotal validation study for the LungLB technology, we believe that will be covered by the use of proceeds. It'll allow us to get into our utility studies, which will help with garnering reimbursement support, very critical for diagnostics.
And when will the validation study start, do you think, for first patients? And how big is it? So if you said you did 149 in your pilot, that's quite a lot, actually. I mean, how many are you going to do on your validation? I mean, you've probably done a big chunk of it.
Right. 425 is what we're looking at for validation right now. Same population, so patients who are getting a biopsy, and then it'll be blinded, multi-center, very similar to the pilot study. We anticipate that taking around 12 to 18 months for enrollment and completion. And the reason it's so quick is it's a point in time comparison, right? Blood to biopsy. You don't have to follow these patients for very long periods of time. The post-surgical monitoring study, it's a bit longer. We have to follow those patients for 2 years, but we want to kick those off at the same time, which will be later this year. Because as more lung cancers are found in our nodule program, then those same people can be funneled into the post-surgical monitoring program, right? You have early stage lung cancer, now you need to be monitored. So it's sort of a 2-for-1 recruitment effort.
And when will the first patients sort of like move into this? Because obviously COVID has sort of like knocked a lot of the sort of the cancer and trial sort of difficulties. But I'm guessing Mount Sinai probably do quite a bit of the actual sort of treatment of cancers. And so they probably can help with sort of first patients, I imagine, just through what they normally do.
Yeah, they do on the order of 400 biopsies every year for indeterminate lung nodules. Their clinic has been open for about 8-9 months now. Since COVID, they were shut down for a little bit. But now there's actually a significant backlog. A number of patients who've missed their CT scans have been delaying biopsies or delaying lung cancer surgeries. So we're seeing a lot of pent up demand in terms of getting patients enrolled into studies like ours.
Yeah, so. No, well, I can imagine. I mean, the cancer diagnosis has really taken backstage. It's just in the UK, there's a massive mountain of people that need sort of like, screenings and all that kind of CT stuff. So your test it does mean you can accelerate that process, can you? To help a number of people.
Yes, unfortunately.
I know it's regulatory.
A lot of delays in diagnosis. So hopefully we'll be able to help out in that area.
Yeah, and then your FDA approvals comes after your validation test, does it? And that's sort of like towards the back end of 2022. Is that sort of the idea? And then you actually do first sales in 2023.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. If one thing that I've learned is don't set your clock to the FDA. They definitely have their hands full with COVID and a number of other approvals that they're looking at. So what we're actually going to do is commercialize the technology after the validation study. We have what's called our CLIA license here in the United States. Actually, it's a little bit unknown, I think, outside the US, but most clinical diagnostics here are offered under CLIA without FDA approval. And so our idea is we'll start commercializing after the validation study. while we're waiting for the broader FDA approval.
Yeah.
Now FDA is strictly voluntary, right? I could stick with CLIA alone, but we believe at LungLife that the scientific rigor that's required to go through the FDA, that's going to provide confidence to everybody, the doctors, the people with indeterminate nodules, and then for our side, the payers, right? How you get reimbursed. So that's why we're going down the FDA route.
Okay. And then the technology, presumably it's patented, is it? I'm guessing is your own patents and sort of licensing patents. Is that correct?
That's right. You know, we have not only patents, but we have a lot of proprietary and institutional know-how that we sort of keep secret to ourselves.
Yeah.
The core technology is from MD Anderson Cancer Center. So there's a family of patents that we've licensed in. We're the exclusive worldwide licensees on that. And then since working with the technology over the past few years, we've developed our own IP portfolio here at LungLife. And that's again reflected in our own patent filings, as well as sort of the proprietary know-how that stays within these four walls.
Yeah, and then just adding on that sort of proprietary know-how, presumably when you're doing the validation test and also doing the utility test later on, that's going to add to the depth and width of your biobank of information that your sort of AI systems can then draw upon to get even further insights, presumably, and act as a bigger barrier to entry for anybody else. Is that correct?
That's incredibly valuable, and you're absolutely on point with that. With the artificial intelligence algorithm, and we have a couple going in the background, that allows the technology to continue to learn, to continue to progress, and then we can see that progression sort of, okay, how did it work on this patient data set? Now, how does it work plus AI?
Yeah.
This is the benefit, great. And that continual learning in the background keeps us at the leading edge, keeps us 1 step, 2 steps ahead of our competitors.
Yeah, and is there any? You've talked about sort of like post-operative and early stage tech. Is there anything in drug development you could use the test for? Because I mean, so much money being put into cancer, particularly lung cancer. I mean, it seems as though all the latest immunotherapies are only for really the metastatic, late stage, advanced therapies. Early stage, there's not much. But with this information, presumably, I know it's a longer term plan because you obviously you want to stay focused. But frankly, there's so much valuable information there that the cancer drug companies will pay a fortune for some of that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that you bring that up because, you know, as you touch on, most of the cancers are diagnosed in late stage.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you're running a clinical study, you do have a large group of people who will be eligible to take those drugs. It allows you to run a proper study. But none of those drugs, we don't have an understanding of how they work in early stage because there are so few people to enroll in those studies.
Yeah.
And so we believe technologies like LungLife, it's going to be an enabling technology. So we'll find more of those people in early stage. And then I'd be curious to see if some of those drugs can be repurposed earlier on to say, well, is there a benefit there? You know, combine surgery with another inhibitor that could potentially give that 1-2 hit to the cancer. And
yeah, well, that's just all upside, isn't it? I mean, that's just, you know, sort of extra potential going forward. Now, I just would point investors, I mean, this is all my hypothetical, because I know you can't talk about your forecast, you're not allowed to, but if LungLife managed to get sort of like 5% of these $3 billion US early detection cancer, or should we say lung cancer detection market, then you know, you basically put that just on a modest 5 times sales, and your competitors are on about 9 times, which is Exact Sciences and Veracyte sort of 9 times sales. But if you put it on 5 times, then you get to a share price of over £20 per share compared to the current price, which is up today, which is about £2. So there's plenty of upside there for investors just to sort of like have a look. That's a long-term sort of thing, and those are just hypothetical about mine, but just gives you a value of the upside and really, you know, the urgency as well of this whole, you know, sort of area that is really untapped, isn't it? Early stage lung cancer that hasn't. It's a massive potential opportunity that is currently unmet.
Yeah, and you know, it's a tough nut to crack, right? Early stage lung cancer is not simple, but there's a strong need for it. And, you know, we're going to be very focused on our goals, the validation study, regulatory approval, reimbursement support, all that will help commercialization and get this technology into the hands of people that need it most. I think everything else is going to follow after that.
Brilliant. And what's the sort of like the news flow going forward? Presumably sort of, putting, I don't know, filling out your management team, putting systems in place, and having a foundation year, really getting your validation study up and operational?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great that we have our CLIA license, so we're going to maintain that, but then focus on the rest of the commercialization path with that pivotal validation study. It's going to be incredibly important.
Yeah.
Working with our partners to garner reimbursement support. That's with your code, your price, your coverage. We're going to kick that off later this year. So again, just focusing on that initial product, the LungLB test, and getting it to commercial sales in the next couple of years.
And then if it all goes to plan in 2023, presumably you can get internationalize this outside the States, or even license it out to a major sort of big diagnostics company, couldn't you? Just to get that sort of like footprint quickly.
Yeah, the United States isn't the only place that
I mean, China, crikey, the amount of smokers you've got there. Wow.
Yeah, in the United Kingdom, I mean, Japan, all over the world, lung cancer is a significant problem. And so, we're very focused on lung cancer, very focused on US initially. And then, once we have success here in the States, we'll be looking at, Europe, we're looking to be deploying this technology elsewhere to fulfill unmet needs across the world.
Yeah. Well, I wish you all the best in bringing that to market, because the world desperately needs it. So thanks very much for your time, Paul, and look forward in touching base again going forward.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure.